Hello and good afternoon. I am Sarah Magnoni, and this is Colorful Living Studio, episode 3, and it is the other half, of course, of Ahava Productions and The Farm. So today, having finished our first abstract project, obviously it's not my first abstract project, but we did 2 episodes on creating an automatic drawing and in an abstract format and finishing that painting. So today I wanted to back up a little bit and go back to some very basic exercises for people who are interested in using just straight drawing materials. Now, using drawing materials is vastly broad. There is ink, there is graphite, which by the way is just a fancy name for pencil, but artists like to call it graphite. There is Conte crayon, there is charcoal, there is using a brush and ink as opposed to pen and ink. There are all kinds of ways to draw. And of course, cave people drew right on the walls of caves with natural pigments and their fingers and all kinds of things. The great thing about drawing is that there is no extra medium between the brain, the hand, and the paper. There's no mixing of paint, there's none of that going on. So in many ways, drawing is the most raw and in some cases the most expressive form of art. Having said that, there is no good painting, abstract, representational, any other format, that doesn't start with a good understanding of drawing. So when I say that, I don't necessarily mean drawing a still life, I don't necessarily mean drawing a landscape, a figure, etc. It can be abstract. What drawing does is, without the added responsibility of paint, it organizes the artist's mind and thinking and allows the artist to take some risks, make some mistakes, without the huge commitment of all of the other materials. So when I have beginning students, I very often give them a project which I am going to work on right here, and it's a grid project. Now I'm going to draw a grid on this 22 by 30 inch piece of watercolor paper, and the idea of doing this is that it's a basic warm-up exercise. It's like sitting at a piano and doing scales, or singing and doing scales. Da 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 da. That's what it's like. It's a warm-up. So for an artist, what doing the grid does is it forces the artist to treat each square as though it is the design for a separate painting. And that is quite challenging. It forces the artist to think both globally and in very small format. So basically, it's a thumbnail drawing. Those of you who are familiar with YouTube know that YouTube uses the term thumbnail. Well, that's very interesting. Where does that come from? It comes from art. It comes from visual art. So each one of these little squares that I'm going to do in a drawing format is going to be a thumbnail drawing. Most great artists throughout art history have done thumbnails or sketchbooks before they completed large paintings. So let's get started. I am going to use a black Conte crayon to draw the grid. I've got a T-square here. And what I did with my paper, just for those people who really do want to work larger than a sketchbook, because remember this easel does not have a back to it, it only has an aluminum post here. So to keep the drawing paper in one place, I have it thumbtacked to a piece of foam core. So it's a very good idea at home in your studio, wherever you happen to be working, to keep foam core around so that you can work with larger paper other than, you know, a 16 by 20 sketchbook or an 11 by 14 sketchbook. It gives you a lot more options. So what I've done is I put the T-square on the top of the foam core, and I'm going to start drawing some lines. First, I'm going to get my glasses on because I can't see anything without them. So here we go. So we are in one of the other rooms in the upstairs of my house, which is adjacent to the studio. And I have brought out 3 completely graphite pieces. These are not Conte crayon, they're not charcoal. These are graphite on 300-pound watercolor paper. So just to give you a sense of the range of what can happen with pencil, this piece is called Religion in America, and it is a very symbolic piece. There are items in this drawing that are all in my house. So I used literally pieces of my own family history to construct a completely constructed composition. Okay, so these things are not all placed in this spot. This is something you can do in composing a symbolic piece or in composing any still life. It represents at least 10 different religions. There's Judaism, there's Buddhism, there's Shinto, there's Native American religion, Christianity, Islam. So the idea of well, I said painting, it's really kind of, and then of course there's wine, which in my family is kind of a religion. And plants and gardens, and there's Lucky the dog out in the back through the French doors. The idea, and Desna the dog over here on the right-hand side. The idea of this drawing is to indicate that we are a secular society, by and large, encompassing many, many, many different religious and spiritual viewpoints. And I'm quite happy to represent that and have it stay that way. I used blending tools and a lot of heavy contrast. I went back over certain parts of the drawing several times to darken the pencil. So don't be afraid when you're working to go really dark. Now, another thing that I did not mention, which is fixative. Krylon makes a great fixative when you're working in graphite, Conte crayon, pastel, charcoal, etc. You can preserve your drawings because they will smudge and the pigment will actually disappear over time by putting another sheet of paper on top of them, storing them flat. But before you do that, you should spray every drawing with fixative according to the directions on the spray can. The chief one being lots of good ventilation. So as always, because this is my visual sense, I am probably going to start somewhere in the middle and then kind of fill in around the middle. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with graphite, okay? This is a pencil. Just for those of you who don't know what it is, this is just a regular number 2 Amazon pencil, all right? So it's got an eraser. You should keep extra erasers with you, and always have a sharpener available, because if you are really digging deep, and we'll show you some graphite pieces that I've done in the past, if you're really digging deep into that paper, you're going to end up destroying your point fairly easily. So I'm going to start right here, and I am going to work in abstract form. One of the things I want to show you is what you can do just with the pencil, okay, to establish volume, and I'm basically working with this little rectangle here exactly the way I worked in much larger format on the original abstraction. So remember, we're working without paint. What we want to do with this space is unflatten it. Okay, so how do we do that? We've got a rectangle here. I've created volume just by making it three-dimensional. So there we go. Now we have, without using paint, we have part of this rectangle which is actually coming out towards the camera and part of it going backwards. And that was just with very, very simple use of the pencil. I'm using it almost like a coloring device. That's not the only thing we can do with the pencil or graphite, and I'll show you that in a minute. Okay, so I did the same thing with this kind of sail-like shape. So let's do the same thing with the circle. So we've created some dimension. This is a very, very simple stroke with the pencil. Lots of other things you can do, and I'll show you that in a minute. In the meantime, I'm just going to do some designs. And using the same stroke, fill in between these little triangles just to create some dark and light.
You're no longer the star of the show.
And we have our studio cat named Binx, who is an elegant, almost dark graphite shade of black, and she's got gray undertones on her belly, right, Binx? She's not really helpful in terms of managing the supplies in the studio, but other than that, she's a delight to have. Every studio needs a cat, so I strongly recommend that all studios have cats. Okay, so now I'm going to use the edge of the pencil. And again, the reason I'm showing you this, so we get a much softer shading here, and I'm going to show you how we can make that even softer. And that's the side of the point of the pencil. So even with a very, very simple pencil drawing, there can be extremes of contrast. And it's really fun to do that. And then I'm going to take something called a blending tool. And this is a blending tool. They come in all kinds of sizes that you keep a whole bunch of them available. They do get kind of messy at times. You can see I've used these quite a bit. So I am, and by the way, your hands are going to get very messy when you do this, so expect that. I'm going to take this blending tool and make this even softer. And then come up like this, and it gets lighter and lighter because of course I did not carry the pencil all the way up. I left part of it blank. So now we've got something that has the quality almost of a watercolor wash. And all it is a pencil. But there's a really beautiful, soft quality to that. Okay, now let's get a little more dramatic. Again, with pencil, you can do the same thing that you do with paint. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make these lines much, much darker and a little thicker. Okay, so let's say you decide with this tiny little design, you want to add some highlights. Enter your eraser. Let's do this. So now we've got texture, and all I did was use the eraser. Okay? So let's move on to another square. The second piece is actually one of my very favorite pieces because I love the beach and the shore, and this is called Return to the Ocean. And the title is based on a poem by Walt Whitman. So this piece encompasses, again, some sculpture that I have, the duck and the shorebird, and there's another shorebird, and lots of shells, which I absolutely love. I actually bought those shells one of the times that I was on Long Beach Island. They're very, very large and very beautiful and impressive. So once again, this was an instance where I used a blending tool. In fact, this is quite interesting, I'll point this out to you, to do the entire sky and beach. Okay, there's very little graphite or pigment there. I just blended and used what was actually on the blending tool to add some pigment to the paper, and then I did what I just showed you in the grid piece. I actually used the eraser to create highlights once I blended the background. I'm going to cut this little rectangle in half, and I'm going to use the pencil just in a textural way. So I'm going to do something called cross-hatching. This is cross-hatching. This is another way to create dark, light, and texture with using the pencil in a lot of different ways to create all kinds of effects that you normally associate with paint. So this is a situation where I've cross-hatched. I could either blend that or I could leave it unblended. I think what I'm going to do is just see what happens when I take my blending tool do a little bit of blending. Basically what's happening here is the cross-hatching remains. It's darker than it was, but I'm using the graphite that I picked up from the cross-hatching to actually shade the space right below. So the point here is that literally anything can happen using this incredible drawing medium. And what I'm going to do is just to give you a picture of the difference between charcoal and pencil. This is charcoal, okay? So let's do some charcoal in this thumbnail. Now right away you can see that it is a much, much heavier compressed color and drawing medium, and very, very rich. So I'm going to take this and we're actually going to do checks. Now what's interesting and wonderful about charcoal, and particularly if you have a love for primitive art, which I do, is that charcoal has, if used this way, a kind of primitive nature to the way it hits the paper. And that's really fun. And it's good to have a cat climbing up your leg while you're doing this. Thank you, Binx. One of the great things about having a cat in the studio is that the issues of the philosophical issues become clear, because really, basically, it's her world, not mine. And it's always a good idea to remember that with animals. You don't have much control over it. The cat is attached to my apron strings. Feels totally different. And it's very intense. Just the process of using it is, it's just very rich. Very, very rich. It feels very good to use it. Okay, so let's use the charcoal somewhere else in a different way. And this time, I'm just going to use it like this. And remember, the goal here is to give you ideas. So let's assume that you have a 40-inch by 40-inch canvas, or a 30 by 40-inch canvas, and it's going to be abstract. And this is the basis for your composition right here. So when you're working on these little rectangles, the idea is to challenge yourself to create something that at the very least is a jumping off point for a larger piece of work. Okay, so let's keep going here. I think I'm going to add some charcoal, and that's another thing that I want people to be able to do, which is to move from one kind of drawing material to another kind of drawing material in the same piece. And you can do that in painting as well. Okay, so let's keep going. I'm going to go back to a Conte crayon this time. And let's do some of the same thinking using the Conte crayon. And this time, I'm going to do more of an all-over pattern. Now, the difference between Conte crayon and charcoal, because the Conte crayon is just as intense, is that Conte, although very easy to blend, is not quite as soft as charcoal. I'm actually going to go for a black background, and those triangles are going to be my light area. Now, if you notice, because the Conte crayon is softer, it's not as soft as charcoal, but it's softer than pencil, I'm getting a considerable amount of pigment You can sometimes blow it off, which I just did. There are devices for people who do really detailed graphite drawings that actually hold the Conte crayon or the graphite, the pencil, in, because you can see my hands are very messy, okay? So if you're working on a paper that has to remain completely clean, I'm not particularly concerned with that right now. There's a device, it's almost like a 1920s cigarette holder that holds the pencil at the end of the holder so that your hand doesn't have to get near the paper because it will smudge. So it depends on what your tolerance level is, but you can look for that. You can buy those on Amazon. I don't use them because I really like smudginess. I enjoy that. And we'll show you some rather detailed representational graphite pieces that I've done that give you a sense for how you can use really everything that I'm doing here. It's no different, to create some pretty beautiful representational work. So I am going to use a blending tool, in this case, to do this little area. Although this has a really nice quality to it, it looks kind of like a print. If you've seen black and white illustrations in books, in children's books, adult, whatever, you very often will see these little bits of paper coming through the underneath the drawing material. But I am actually going to create something that looks a little, hi Binx, I felt that. So the blending tool is literally doing the same thing here that a paintbrush would do. It's actually dispersing the pigment. So now we've got this really, really rich black. And I'm just going to blow on this to get rid of the little bits and pieces that were going down into the next square. So the third piece, which is quite dramatic, is called "O Holy Night." And again, it's one of my, first of all, it's one of my favorite Christmas carols. It's a beautiful song. This, somewhat like Religion in America, was a wholly constructed landscape. In other words, I used my knowledge of mountain ranges and the way in which trees kind of come down the edges of mountains to open fields. And then I found images of animals that I wanted to include in this drawing, which again, admittedly, this is not something that I actually saw out in the field and drew. I constructed it. That's a good way to use photographs. It's not what I would recommend to beginners, or if you are using photographs to work from, use your own photographs. But in this case, I was looking again for a symbolic piece. So there are rabbits, there are goats, there are deer, there are bison, there are horses. Right in the right-hand corner, there's a little miniature horse who we once had, who I miss very dearly. He's no longer with us. There's a fox. And the idea, of course, is this tree in the middle of this group of animals. And whether it represents Christianity or not, it represents what I feel nature is about. And that's why I called it "O Holy Night." So I hope you enjoyed seeing some of my work. Oh, and by the way, I used very much the same technique to create highlights on the mountains. I used the eraser. Once I got the pigment onto the paper, I then erased where I wanted the highlights to appear. So just for practical and logistical purposes, again, these are all 350-pound watercolor paper, and they're 22 by 30. I hope you enjoyed this little gallery tour. And again, please like, comment, and subscribe. Tell me about your drawings. Show me your drawings. And if you want a short critique, I'd be happy to put that on the YouTube channel. But I think you can see the variety of texture and the variety of contrast, dark, light, volume, flat, etc., that you can achieve with extremely simple tools. As I say, you do not absolutely have to have paint. So let me just take a minute and talk about the kind of paper I'm using. Now, when I do this kind of work, I prefer, obviously I am a person who likes to work a little larger. You don't have to work larger. You can use Strathmore multimedia sketchbooks. You can use Canson multimedia sketchbooks in virtually any size. What is generally used in life drawing classes, because it's extremely inexpensive, but it's also very, very lightweight, is something called newsprint. And newsprint generally comes on really big pads, because the assumption is that in a life drawing class, you're going to be drawing a figure, a large figure. It's very lightweight. You have to use something to back it up so that while you're working with it, you don't like knock the thing over. I don't recommend that for people doing this kind of work. If you're in a life drawing studio, it's a great thing. You got to keep turning those pages, because you'll do 5-minute poses, you'll do 10-minute poses, you'll do 20-minute poses, and you got to keep turning those pages. So you need something really lightweight. But if you're working in your studio or at home, this is actually something called 250-pound watercolor paper. Watercolor paper goes up to 350 pounds. The weight refers to the weight of a ream of paper. In other words, this sheet of paper is not 250 pounds. So it's a batch of paper that weighs 250. So the 250 is slightly lighter weight than 350. I love 350-pound paper. It literally stands up on its own, which I absolutely love. But 250 is fine. And I'm just going to take a minute to remove Binx from the water container because she's going to knock it over. Here, let's put it down here. I'll fill up your little bowl. There. That way, if you knock it over, it just goes right to the floor. So make sure, if you have a cat in the studio, that the water is clean. She also, unlike most cats, likes to climb into the bathtub. So she's a very, very funny cat. But anyway, so we talked about the paper, and of course I mentioned that it's my way of working to attach it to a piece of foam core. And what I'm going to do over the next couple of days, and we will come back and probably take a look at this finished in the next episode. Right now, I'm going to veer away from black and white and go to my other Conte crayons, which are color. So let's add some color to this. I'll do a couple more rectangles. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use these very wonderful Conte colors. I started out with a pink, and this is kind of a coral color. And as you can see, if you look closely, there's that pigment. It's doing the same thing that the black and white pigment did. So again, be prepared for a little mess. This is a slightly darker pink. And what I'm going to do is use another warm color. right in that blank area. It's a yellow. Then we're going to go to our blending tool and see what happens. One of the great things about doing this is it is experimental.
It stands out so much. It's so lush.
It's very, very lush. That Conte is a good company to use because their color organization is very, very specific and based on real painterly color organization. So if you use these techniques with Conte in color, you're essentially painting. And it's just neat to use it in this format rather than with a brush. It's just a very, very, very nice process. And they're beautiful, beautiful products. So let's go to a terracotta. And then I'm going to get to a white. If you look at this and look at what happens when you blend, it really has the feeling, almost the feeling of oil paint. So even more than acrylic paint, and Binx is actually using a pencil over there. She has been inspired let's see if she can pick it up. Nope, no opposable thumbs. Can't quite get it, but I have seen cats actually, she's just taking a snack there. I've seen cats actually paint. If you give them the opportunity and don't mind the mess.
Finger paint?
Paw paint. So, what I'm hoping right now is that this gives you a lot of ideas for how to jumpstart your own ability to compose on a whim, okay? So if you're staring at a blank canvas and wondering, what am I going to do with it? Do this instead. And by the time you finish this, you'll have 20 or 30 painting ideas in one shot. So I look forward in the comments to your sending me attachments of the grid pieces that you have done. So like, comment, and subscribe. And don't forget to visit our gallery at www.ahava Farm Colorful Living Studio under Art in Support of Animals, and take a look at my work. And please let me know how you're doing, and I'll see you in the next episode.